May 22, 2011, 5:38 in the evening, Joplin, Missouri. Sunday was not over yet. Families were returning from a graduation ceremony, restaurants were taking orders, shoppers were moving through stores, and another routine shift was underway at St. John's Regional Medical Center. A heavy green-black sky already hung above the city, but people here were accustomed to spring thunderstorms. Sirens had sounded before. Sometimes the danger passed to the north. Sometimes the storm weakened before reaching the neighborhoods. So when the warning came again, many residents did not immediately run for shelter. They walked to their windows, turned on the television, called relatives, tried to determine whether the alert truly concerned them. But the second signal was unusual. City officials almost never activated the sirens twice in succession. This time, dispatchers were already receiving reports of a tornado on the ground. And while residents searched for confirmation, something almost impossible to see was approaching Joplin's western edge behind a wall of rain. The danger had begun assembling long before that moment. 2 days earlier, meteorologists had warned of severe thunderstorms, enormous hail, and destructive wind gusts. Isolated tornadoes were also possible, but at first they did not appear to be the primary threat. By early Sunday morning, the forecast had become more alarming. Warm, moisture-filled air over the southern plains collided with a cold front and powerful winds moving in different directions at different altitudes. The atmosphere was capable of making a thunderstorm rotate for hours. During the afternoon, a supercell formed over southeastern Kansas and moved toward Missouri. Its structure became increasingly organized on weather radar. At 5:17 in the evening, the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning that included all of Joplin. However, the city's first siren activation had occurred earlier and was connected to reports of another funnel farther north. For residents, this created dangerous confusion. They had heard the signal, but many assumed the center of the threat would miss them. The city had received a warning, but the warning had not yet become action. At approximately 5:34, the tornado was already on the ground west of the city. At first, it was relatively small and hidden by heavy precipitation. Then, within only a few minutes, it began to widen and intensify. Observers did not see the classic shape of a narrow funnel. They saw a dark mass resembling a low wall of clouds, with electrical lines flashing inside it. Rain hammered windshields, roads filled with traffic, and drivers struggled to understand where the storm was moving. At 5:38, the sirens were activated for a second time. For many people, that unusual repetition became the final proof that the danger was real. Inside homes, families grabbed children and pets. Store employees moved customers away from glass storefronts. On the roads, drivers turned around without realizing that some routes were already leading directly toward the tornado. But what happened next exceeded even what meteorologists were seeing on their screens. The tornado did not weaken before entering the city. It transformed into a violent multiple vortex wall at approximately more than 1.5 kilometers wide. The tornado was already on the ground west of the city. At first, it was relatively small and hit by heavy precipitation. The western neighborhoods vanished inside a grey brown vortex. It began to widen and intensify. It was not merely observers did not see the classic shape of a narrow thunder in which trees snapped. They saw a dark mass resembling a low wall of clouds of pieces of electrical lines flashing inside it. Then the atmosphere filled with windshields, roads filled with traffic fragments, and drivers struggled to understand houses lost their roofs in seconds. Walls folded in. 5:38, the sirens were activated for a second turn. For many streets, that unusual repetition became the final proof that the danger was real. Blasted by an enormous homes, families grabbed children and people sheltering in bathrooms. Store employees moved customers away from glass storefronts. While changing roads, drivers turned around without realizing that some routes were already visibility almost to zero. The tornado moved relatively slowly, exceeding around 30 meteorologists per hour, allowing its core of destruction to remain over each neighborhood for longer. It transformed into a violent multiple-scale wall, more than 1.5 kilometers wide. Estimated winds exceeded 322 kilometers per hour. But the true scale of the disaster became clear only when the vortex reached the buildings supposed to help the city survive. The sound arrived St. John's Regional Medical Center was not merely a roar in the tornado's unbroken Joplin's most important emergency facilities. Roofs tore away, 183 patients were pieces of debris collided in the air. The staff had only minutes to pull beds away from windows and move people into corridors, metal, and then the tornado struck the building directly. Houses lost their roofs, every window shattered. Walls folded in, blasted through the interior. Were lifted. The upper floor suffered severe damage. Medical equipment stopped operating. Trees were stripped of branches and bark as though they had been blasted by an enormous industrial machine. 6 people died inside the hospital. People sheltering in remaining patients had to be evacuated from the damaged structure in darkness and while changing pressure, while the surrounding roads were buried under debris. Visibility for the hospital was only the beginning. The tornado struck a nursing home at around 32 kilometers per hour, allowing its core of destruction to remain over each electrical substation and communications towers. At the precise moment when thousands of people needed assistance, estimated winds exceeded 300 itself was losing vehicles, electricity. But the true scale of the disaster became clear only when the vortex reached the buildings was no longer destroying individual buildings. It was beginning to take away the city's ability to rescue itself. The tornado was already on the ground west of the city. Joplin did not remain motionless. At first, it was relatively small and hidden by heavy precipitation. A man stepped onto the porch after the first siren. Within only a few minutes, it began to widen and intensify. Only after the second warning did his wife scream the classic shape of a narrow funnel. The family saw a dark mass resembling a low wall of clouds, with electrical lines flashing inside. Moment their house was destroyed. Rain-hammered windshields in commercial buildings filled with employees led strangers into storage struggled to understand where the storm was moving. Family gatherings were still continuing after the graduation ceremony. Activated for a second time. Around 150 people remained inside a university repetition became the final school principal managed to move them into a basement shelter. Inside homes, other graduates were already driving through the city or had store employees moved customers away from glass storefronts. The tornado killed 7 students, including on the one road, drivers turned around without realizing that some routes were already leading inside the ruined hospital. Doctors and nurses did not leave to search for their own families even what meteorologists were carried on their screens. Then, the tornado did not weaken before entering the residents and rescuers began to a violent multiple with their bare hands, more than 1.5 kilometers wide, and reached Joplin at many had no uniforms, no tools, and no working communications. The western neighborhoods had only the understanding that waiting was not an option. The tornado remained on the ground for approximately 32 minutes. It was not merely a roar and left an unbroken mechanical thunder in which trees snapped. The most violent corridor crossed thousands of pieces of debris collided in the air. Joplin. Then the atmosphere filled with businesses were damaged or destroyed, and fragments of asphalt. Investigations counted around 8,000 lost their roofs buildings and nearly 7,500 residential properties. Vehicles were lifted. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to flat fields where streets could be identified. Trees were stripped of branches and bark as though they had been blasted by an enormous industrial machine. To restore. People sheltering in bathrooms and interior hallways felt the floors. The National Weather Service recorded one changing 58 doors in their frames, while other official investigations produced almost to zero. When indirect the tornado moved relatively slowly were included. At around 32 kilometers per hour, 142, allowing its core of destruction to remain over each neighborhood for longer, does not match the accepted official death toll. It had become an enhanced Fujita scale. Damage was estimated at approximately $3 billion. Estimated winds exceeded making the Joplin tornado the costliest single tornado in United States history. But the true scale of the disaster became clear only when the vortex reached the buildings failed to capture the central reality. In only a few minutes, the familiar map of the city tornado was already on the ground west of the city. Joplin changed more than a single city. At first, it was relatively small. The investigation revealed a terrifying paradox. Then, a warning only a few minutes in advance, it began to widen and intensify. Television observers did not see the classic shape of a narrow funnel. Most residents understood the basic rules resembling a low wall of clouds, and yet with electrical lines their final available minutes, searching for proof that the danger truly applied to them. Traffic, and drivers struggled to understand where the storm was wait for additional confirmation. At 5:38, the sirens were activated for a second time. Few buildings in the city had basements. That unusual repetition became the final proof that the danger was tornado. After the disaster, families demanded clearer warnings that described not only atmospheric rotation from glass but the destruction people should expect. On the roads, drivers turned around without realizing that construction standards and more protected shelter toward the tornado. Joplin rebuilt its schools, neighborhoods and even what meteorologists designing the new medical center with the next disaster. The tornado did not weaken before entering the city. But the most important lesson was not that nature could be defeated. Multiple vortex. It was simpler and more than 1.5 kilometers wide. And when a siren sounds in a city where disaster has always passed nearby, at approximately 5:41, the most dangerous decision the western neighborhood vanished inside a grey-brown vortex. Sometimes the sound arrived an ordinary Sunday evening. It was not merely a roar of an entire neighborhood, unbroken mechanical thunder in which trees snapped, roofs tore away.